Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Our program this evening, organized by the Goldstein-Goren Diaspora Research Center, focuses on a new research titled Israel's Moment, International Support and Opposition to Establishing the Jewish State, 1945-1949, published only a few months ago by the Cambridge University Press. And it is a great pleasure, I believe in the name of all of you, all the participants, to congratulate the author, our colleague and our dear friend, Professor Jeffrey Herf from the University of Maryland, College Park, for his new research achievement. So congratulations, Jeffrey.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
We will begin our program with a short introduction from Jeffrey on his book. Then I'll relate briefly to two main significant issues, central, I think, to the thesis that they raise some interesting questions. And my comments will be followed by two presentations of Professor Aviva Halmish and Professor Yaakov Roy. And then we will open the floor for more questions and comments. So Professor Herf, Jeffrey, please.
Professor Sauer, Ronnie, thank you. Professor Roy, Professor Halamish, thank you as well. It's really a great privilege and honor to be speaking via Zoom to colleagues and
Jeffrey, I just forgot to introduce you. So let me
okay. Well, you may introduce me if you wish.
Yes, sorry. So let me just say a few words about your work. So Professor Jeffrey Herf is a distinguished university professor in the Department of History at the University of Maryland, College Park, where he teaches modern European history with a focus on Germany since 1914. He published numerous studies on German history, Nazi Germany, Holocaust memory, the attitude towards Zionism in Israel. The two latest studies are Undeclared Wars with Israel, East Germany, and West German far left, 1967 and 1989. And only 6 years later, and most recently, Israel's moment. So please, Jeffrey.
Well, thank you for the introduction. And thank you again, Professor Stauber, Professor Halamish, Professor Roy. And I'm really very pleased to be speaking to an audience in Tel Aviv. I have such very fond and warm memories of the times I've spent in Tel Aviv and look forward to being there again. I'll speak for 20 minutes. Ronnie, if I speak after 20 minutes, you tell me when I have another, or when I have another minute or so. I don't want to go over my time, and I want to leave plenty of time for comments. Israel's moment refers to that brief period of May 1947 to May 1949, when both the Soviet Union and the President of the United States supported the establishment of a Jewish state in post-British Mandate Palestine. That rare agreement took place in the interregnum between the end of the World War II and the Holocaust and the first months of the Cold War. In those years, anti-Nazism and anti-communism existed in an uneasy simultaneity. The foundation of the State of Israel was a highly contingent event that was facilitated by this short-lived but tenuous agreement between the Soviet Union and the White House. Israel's moment adds to the voluminous scholarship on this famous event on the basis of archival research in the files of the United States State Department and the Department of Defense, the French Foreign Ministry, the French Ministry of the Interior, in political debate in the United States, and in the public records of the United Nations General Assembly and Security Council. So here are 5 core findings of its 500 pages. First, while President Truman's support for the Zionist project was crucial, the support of the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc was even more consequential, both in the diplomatic battles at the United Nations and when Czechoslovakia, in violation of the United Nations arms embargo, with Soviet agreement, sent arms to the Jews when they needed them most in 1948. And when the Soviet bloc and the Interior Ministry of France, as we'll see in a moment, facilitated Jewish immigration to Palestine. The window of opportunity for the establishment of the Jewish state was brief and was made possible, most importantly, by the Jews in Palestine themselves, but also by the fresh memories of the Holocaust and the anti-Nazi passions and anti-racist passions in its immediate aftermath. Part of the political greatness and courage and insight of David Ben-Gurion and the future foreign minister Moshe Sharett was to have seized this very brief moment to establish the state. Second, perhaps due to the understandable attention devoted to Truman's support for the UN partition resolution in 1947 and then his decision to recognize the new state in 1948, historians have not paid sufficient attention to the emphatic, persistent, and consequential opposition to the Zionist project in the United States Department of State, the Department of Defense, and the Central Intelligence Agency. Israel's moment presents more evidence than has appeared in the scholarship so far about an anti-Zionist consensus that emerged at the top of the United States national security establishment, led by Secretary of State George Marshall and articulated most eloquently by the first director of the policy planning staff, George Kennan. These leaders viewed the establishment of the Jewish state in Palestine as a threat to American and Western access to Arab oil and as a boon to prospects for Soviet and communist expansion in the Middle East, and therefore as a threat to the national security interests of the United States in the early months and years of the global policy of containment of the Soviet Union and communism. The anti-communist arguments cut against support for the Zionist project in the State Department and in the Pentagon. Third, though support for the establishment of the Jewish state in the United States encompassed both the Democratic and Republican parties, the loudest and most persistent voices in the political realm and outside the formal organizations of the Jewish community and the synagogues came from some of the most prominent liberal politicians in American politics. They included figures such as Senator Robert Wagner, who was the author of the Social Security Act, and Congressman Emanuel Seller, who supported immigration reform, former Assistant Secretary of State Sumner Welles, journalist Frida Kirchway, I.F. Stone, the left-leaning magazine The Nation, the liberal magazine The New Republic, the left-leaning dailies PM and the New York Post, institutions that may not be as well known in Israel, but at the time they were agenda-setting political and journalistic aspects of American liberalism and left liberalism. Fourth, the Nazi collaborationist past of the leaders of the Arab Higher Committee, the leader of the leading organization of the Palestine Arabs in those years. This Nazi collaborationist past was a factor of major public debate in the United States. The public record of those years indicates also that Jamal Husseini, the United Nations representative, the representative of the Arab Higher Committee at the United Nations, was explicit in several speeches, one in London and one in New York, in his belief that racial homogeneity in the Middle East precluded the presence of an alien Jewish state. The racism of the nationalism of the Palestine Arabs, of the leadership of the Palestine Arabs, I'm not talking about the Palestinians as a whole, but the Arab Higher Committee, the racism as articulated by Jamal Husseini was explicit and public and is generally long forgotten or never known. Fifth, the book offers more details about the refusal of the French Foreign Ministry to extradite the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Hashim al-Husseini, for trial for war crimes based on primarily on his propaganda on Nazi radio, when it could have done so when it had him under house arrest in 1945-46. I worked in the French diplomatic archives in La Courneuve in Paris, which are fascinating. Tzila Hershko in Israel has done some work there as well. The Israel's Moment offers more details about the consensus in the French Foreign Ministry that getting on the good side of Haj Amin al-Husseini would be good for the French position in post-war North Africa and the Middle East. But the book also tells another story about the very divided coalition government of the Fourth Republic, led by Prime Minister Paul Ramadier and Foreign Minister Georges Bidault. The French Interior Ministry was led by socialists, first Adrien Tixier, Edouard Depreux, and Jules Moch, and the Interior Ministry played a significant role in working with the Mossad quietly and discreetly to facilitate Jewish immigration to Palestine, both before, during, and after the Exodus affair. Because I want to keep my remarks to 20 minutes, I'm going to skip some of the discussions of American liberals in 1945, 1946, except to say this, that the American Zionist Emergency Council, Benjamin Axon, who later was a political scientist at Hebrew University, but Abba Silver and and others did all they could to get the State Department to indict Husseini, and they offered very impressive evidence in 1945-46 about his collaboration with the Nazis. They were unable to do that. And so one of the themes of the book is to recall the limits on the power and influence of American Jews in those years. I argue that the absence of a post-war trial of Husseini was a significant American diplomatic blunder, a terrible failure, that if such a trial had taken place and if the full record of his collaboration had become a matter of broad public understanding, that his political career may have been damaged, and that perhaps more moderate, or rather not more, perhaps moderate figures in Palestine could have come to the fore who would have accepted the perfectly good deal of two states in the partition plan. The files of the French Foreign Ministry indicate that that French diplomats concluded that getting on the good side of Husseini was very important for preserving French influence in the region. The arguments, so the opposition to the Zionist project had a great deal to do with preserving the French imperial position. I'm going to skip quoting Jamal Husseini's speech of September 29, 1947, except to say that he asserted that the Arab world is a racial homogeneity that extends over the southern and parts of the eastern seaboard of the Mediterranean Sea, and he made the case in favor of racial homogeneity, not in favor of diversity, not in favor of multi-ethnicity, but in favor of racial homogeneity. It was on those grounds, among others, that he opposed the Zionist project. Andrei Gromyko's speech of May 1947 in favor of the two-state solution is familiar to this audience, and Professor Roy, of course, knows far more about Soviet foreign policy in those years than I do, and I look forward to his comments. The UN files also indicate the intervention of Alfred Federkivich, the Polish representative of the United Nations, and he stunned the United Nations General Assembly or one of the committees of the UN when he revealed to them in May of 47 that he was a survivor of Auschwitz-Birkenau, and he had seen in person 1.5 million Jews, 1.5 to 2 million Jews, in his words, burned in crematoria. And he then refers to the close bond that was formed between Jews and Poles. There's romance about that as well, but there was a reality to it, and Federkivich expressed it, and the I found that quite. I found the interventions of Federkivich and Oscar Lange and others quite interesting. The work in the French archives. I'm a historian of Germany, so I had to work hard on my French. But the National Archives in Pierrefitte and the diplomatic archives in La Courneuve are very, very pleasant places to work, and the archivists were most helpful. The Professor Halamish has written superb work about the Exodus affair, as has Aryeh Kochavi's work on British tensions with the French. The French files indicate that that the Interior Ministry under Dutroux and Jules Moch were infuriating the British government because while people referred to clandestine immigration, the British government and the French government knew everything that was going on regarding Jewish immigration. They knew when every ship left. They knew when every train arrived. They knew how many people were. There was nothing secret, nothing hidden from the French and British government. And the Interior Ministry, which controlled ports and the police and visas and all those kind of details, in effect understood very well that it had the power to prevent Jews from emigrating from France to Palestine, and Dutroux and Moch used their power instead to facilitate that immigration. And that is not a story that is well known in the United States. And that story and those sentiments and those passions, I think, are part of the origins of the French de facto alliance with Israel between 1948 and 1967. I'm going to conclude with talking about the State Department. So this will take 2 or 3 minutes, and then I'll be finished. The Exodus affair was one that pulled on the heartstrings of millions, and was a diplomatic debacle for Britain. And it was part of the momentum in public opinion in Europe and in the United States in favor of the Zionist project. And it was that summer of 47 that Foreign Minister Ernst Bevin spoke with Secretary of State George Marshall and argued that that this would be a Jewish state in Palestine would be a disaster for the Anglo-American consensus in the early days of the Cold War. And in the fall of 1947, the State Department organized something called the Pentagon Talks. Loy Henderson, one of the Arabists, did it together with George Kennan. And the conclusion of the Pentagon Talks was that the establishment of a Jewish state would enhance the prospects for Soviet expansion in the Middle East, and that that American policy in the region should make its cornerstone the preservation of British policy in the region. If it had just been the Arabists in the State Department that took this position, the diplomats in Saudi Arabia and Egypt, it might be of less significance. But it rose to the level of a consensus within the State Department because of Secretary of State Marshall and because of George Kennan. And Kennan, who by then was very famous around the world in the United States as the author of the Long Telegram of 1946 about Soviet expansion. And Kennan's memos of January and February of 1948 are defining memos of persistent State Department policy. He opposed the partition plan. He opposed sending any weapons to the Jews. He argued that the United States should reverse its support for the partition plan, both because it would undermine access to Arab oil and because it would facilitate Soviet expansion in the Middle East. The intensity. Finally, President Truman got so fed up with George Kennan and his own State Department that he brought policy back into the White House. And Shlomo Slonim wrote a very important article about 30 years ago about the arms embargo, in which he pointed out that when the Jews needed the weapons, the State Department imposed an embargo on arms to the region, and that was the American liberals and American Zionists were unable, despite their best efforts, to lift the arms embargo, which then became a United Nations arms embargo. So Czechoslovakia sent the arms not only in opposition to the Western policy, but in violation of a United Nations policy. One last comment about Vasyl Tarasenko, given Russia's aggression against Ukraine and Putin's lies about denazifying Ukraine today. Vasyl Tarasenko became a historian at the Shevchenko University in Kiev in the decades after World War II. He was on the Security Council in 1948 with Andrew Gromyko, and in the summer of 48, and here I'm saying things I think that the audience understands, and so I'll abbreviate. The United States and Britain were supporting the Bernadotte Plan, which would have separated the Negev from the new state of Israel. And Tarasenko and Gromyko on the Security Council fought against the Bernadotte Plan. And so you have Gromyko and Tarasenko on the one hand, and the United States and Britain on the other. Last, an anecdote, and this I really will conclude now. Because I come away writing this book with a renewed appreciation for David Ben-Gurion and Moshe Sharett, who emerge, in my view, as some of the great political leaders of world history in the 20th century. In 1949, the State Department was urging Ben-Gurion to allow the Palestinian refugees to come back to Israel, and Ben-Gurion said, well, yes, we can talk about that if they'll sign a peace treaty with us. But before that, no. And then the State Department said, well, look, after all that we've done for you, after all the State Department has done for you in 1947, 48, the United States has done, if you don't agree with us, then we're going to, quote, have to reassess our relationship with Israel. And Ben-Gurion was speaking with James McDonald, who, as many of you know, was the United States' first ambassador, the first American ambassador to Israel. And again, I want to save time, so the full quote is in the book. But the key sentence was that Ben-Gurion said to James McDonald, with whom he was friendly, that if the Jews had waited on the United States in 1948, they, quote, would have been exterminated. And he said that with all gratitude towards Truman's efforts, but Ben-Gurion and Sharett, in a speech at the United Nations as well, were fully aware of the limits of American support and the importance of leftist and liberal and Soviet bloc support. These conclusions may be obvious to this audience, but I can tell you that on American campuses, they challenge a very different conventional wisdom, one that began in world politics in attacks on Israel's legitimacy in the 1970s, and then found a home in parts of the academy and the press. Perhaps the contrasting insights of Ben-Gurion and Sharett in 1949 are common knowledge in Israel today. Whether or not that is the case, my work in the archives that led to this book offers abundant evidence that Ben-Gurion and Sharett understood very well who, in international politics, had supported and who had opposed the anti-imperialist and anti-racist Zionist project. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jeffrey, for the introduction and again for this fascinating book. And before moving on to hear Professor Halamish and Professor Roi's perspective, I would like to relate briefly to two significant issues that raise, I believe, interesting questions. The first is the American and the Soviet perception of the Zionist project. While the extreme objection of the State Department and the Pentagon to the Zionist project is generally known, the contradiction between the behavior of the US officials and the officials of the Eastern Bloc, and particularly the Soviet Union, in Jeffrey's book is striking. Jeffrey stated clearly that without the support of the Eastern Bloc, the Soviet Union, it would have been impossible for the Jewish state to achieve its geopolitical goals and maybe even to survive. On the other hand, Jeffrey quotes, and this was the quote that he mentioned before in his speech. He quotes from Ben-Gurion's correspondence with the American ambassador, James McDonald, saying that had the Jews waited on US or the UN, they would have been exterminated. Jeffrey writes that the communist countries, such as Poland, Czechoslovakia, were Israel's best friends and not the United States. I can understand that the American officials and the CIA experts suspected that among the Jewish immigrants and Holocaust survivors, there were probably many sympathizers of the Soviet Union and even maybe Soviet agents. However, what strikes me is the gap between the solid Western disposition of the leaders of the Zionist movement and the State of Israel, their Western disposition, and the suspicions of the American officials that Israel will not be loyal to the Western camp and might even become a Soviet satellite. On the other hand, and here is probably a question to Professor Ray, I wonder if the Soviets really believed that it is possible that supporting Israel would bring her to the communist bloc, despite the apparent inclination of its leaders towards the West. So this was my first point, and my second point is about the impact of the Holocaust, the Jewish tragedy on the diplomatic decision-making, the political support in the State of Israel. The effects of the Holocaust on Israel's creation have been at the center of prolonged discussion and debates in the Israeli historiography. And the dominant concept among Israeli historians, particularly those with the Zionist orientation, following the well-known article of Eviatar Frizer, is that supporting the establishment of the State of Israel was an outcome of only realpolitik considerations. Accordingly, while the Zionists and notably Ben-Gurion adopted the policy of taking advantage of the catastrophe, it affected mainly the public opinion and put a lot of pressure on the British. However, the political decisions that led to November 1947 and the policy after that resulted from, according to this concept, to this dominant concept in the Israeli historiography, resulted only from realpolitik. Professor Herf, I believe, differs in this point, both in the case of the Eastern Bloc, the politicians of the Eastern Bloc, and he mentioned the representative of Poland in the UN, as well as the French socialist ministries and other veterans of French wartime resistance. Professor Herf emphasizes the impact of the Holocaust on the attitude towards the establishment of the state of Israel. And it would be interesting for me and to others to hear the opinion of Professor Chalamish. I know her opinion, so that's why I bring it to here again. And we had a conversation about it before. So to hear her opinion, and after reading Jeffrey's book, and also Professor Roy's opinion on this topic about the impact of the Holocaust on decision making, which is, I think, very important part of Jeffrey's book. So now we'll move on first to hear Professor Chalamish. I think this is according to the program, isn't it? Yeah. Okay. So Professor Chalamish, our friend Aviva, is a professor emerita of history at the Open University of Israel. She's publishing on Jewish immigration in the 20th century, including Jewish illegal immigration to mandatory Palestine, the history of Zionism and of the Jewish community in mandatory Palestine, and of the State of Israel, among her books, which is so relevant to our meeting today, The Exodus Affair, Holocaust Survivors and the Struggle for Palestine, published in 1998. Please, Aviva.
Good evening, and maybe should I say good afternoon to our friends over the ocean. I would like to open by congratulating Professor Jeffrey Herf and to thank him for the meticulous research and for the eloquent presentation of its fruits. It is not easy to write a book on a topic so much has been written about it, and many might have the impression, a wrong impression, as proven by the book, that all is already well known. I found both the factual base and the fresh interpretation interesting, innovating, and illuminating. And I would divide my experience in reading the book to 4 major categories. The first one includes new facts and nuances. For example, I was surprised by the importance attributed to the support given by the Arabs, maybe should I say even collaboration, and mainly by the Jerusalem Mufti Haj Amin al-Husseini to and with Nazi Germany during World War II, and the impact of it as a factor in shaping the attitude against the Arabs after the war was over. The second category, and I should admit that as a reader that is not totally new to the subject, I was glad to encounter matters I already know, reinforced by documentation and putting the discussion in a wider context. On the background of developments that took place after 1949, this year marks the chronological end of the book, and common conceptions prevailing since then, since 1949, I consider as one of the merits of the book the elaboration, and the previous speakers already related to it, the elaboration upon the major and even crucial role played by the Soviet Union and the Communist bloc in achieving the 2/3 majority for Resolution 181 and in supplying arms to the soon-to-be-born and then the young state of Israel, while the US and other Western states imposed an arms embargo on Israel. The other side of this coin is that the role of the United States in Israel's moment, not only in the book, but in that period, was not something to write home about. And I want to elaborate it because the previous presenters already related to it. Now, the third category of my impressions encompasses insights and interpretations I fully or almost completely agree with, and I accept them. For example, the impact of the Cold War on the policymakers in Washington, in the State Department, the Pentagon, the CIA, with President Truman as an exception. And the assumption by the Soviet Union that the Yishuv and then Israel, young Israel, are on its side in the Cold War. In some of my writings about the Zionist left, I tried to explain that the sympathy, support, and even admiration to the Soviet Union and to Stalin in the years covered by the book are quite understandable, considering the Soviet Union role during World War II, especially after June 1941, the struggle for Palestine, during the struggle for Palestine in the first year or so of Israel independence. And I'm grateful to you, Jeffrey, that for supplying reinforcement to my stand on this issue. In the fourth category are insights and interpretations that I'm not sure I fully endorse or accept, and I would like to elaborate shortly upon one of them already mentioned, the role of the Holocaust in the establishment of Israel. And the question is, did the Holocaust indeed have a decisive role in the establishment of Israel? I have to admit that I am a bit confused. On one hand, the author, Professor Herf, hints, implies there was a connection between these two major events, that meaning in the book and in his speech, he talked earlier, he made it even more explicit, I would say. As in the book, he hints, implied that there was a connection between these two major events. For example, if you want to check on page 261-62, we read that Truman opted in favor of the partition resolution because he thought it was a moral imperative to do so after the Holocaust. Since there is no footnote to substantiate this assertion, it remains for me a matter that needs a further elaboration. And there are some more similar allusions to that claim, where I don't know if the reference to the Holocaust was made in real time, or is it rather interpretation, or it was inserted by the author. But a close reading of the text, supplemented by footnotes, made me relieved, because I found in the book assessments to my claim that the Holocaust and the establishment of Israel were not connected to each other circumstantially. Nevertheless, at certain points in the book, probably between the lines, lies, or maybe it's in the eyes of the reader, the assertion that the Holocaust was indeed a factor in Israel's moment. So I would like to make it clear, I'm not arguing with Professor Herf, but I rather want to express my impressions regarding this matter while reading the book and offer briefly my view on it. The Zionist struggle for statehood after World War II was focused on the issue of the displaced persons, the need to find solution to the living Jews, and did not employ the bitter fate of the murdered Jews. As to the international involvement in the Palestine questions, due to time constraint, I jumped straight to 1947 to the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, UNSCOP, which recommended to partition Palestine and to establish a Jewish state in part of it, and it was based on the impression of the committee members, on impression of the situation in Palestine, and not because of the plight of the Holocaust survivors in Europe, and certainly not the Holocaust itself. As to the superpowers, in a somewhat simplified way, which is presented much more eloquently and in more details in the book, of course, but in somewhat simplified way, I would say that the interest of the two prominent powers of the time can be presented as follows. The United States wished to calm the situation in Palestine and to solve the deep peace problem in Europe, that most of them lived in the American-occupied zone of Germany, some of them in Austria. And the goal of the Soviet Union was to push Britain out of the region in order to create a pro-Soviet stronghold in the Middle East. And as we already know from our book and the conversation and the talks before, the Soviets consider the Jewish community in Palestine, the issue, as their ally. The corresponding interest of the two superpowers produced a momentum of support for establishing Israel. Now, what about the Holocaust? Did the Holocaust play a role, or what was its role in approving Resolution 181 of November 29, 1947? I have to admit that except for Gromyko's speech of May 1947, I was not fully aware to the extent to which representatives of the Soviet bloc spoke about the murder of the Jews of Europe during the 1947-1948 debates at the UN and are exposed in the book. And Professor Herf spoke earlier about what the Polish representative talked about his experience during the war. However, expression of sympathy, sorrow, and even regret resulting from the Holocaust were not necessarily translated into a position in favor of establishing a Jewish state in Palestine. And I would like to present an anecdote I mentioned in my book about the Exodus affair, an episode which may serve to illustrate my contention. The Yugoslav representative to UNSCOP, his name was Vladimir Simic, he was at the port of Haifa when the Exodus immigrants were being transferred to the deportation ships that took them back to France. And he was quoted as saying, "It is the best possible evidence we can have." And that sentence became a key phrase in almost all the writings about the Exodus affair ever since. Best possible evidence to prove what? Why did the Jewish agency bring UNSCOP members to Haifa? In order to prove the necessity, the imperative to establish a Jewish state in Palestine. But Simic, who was so impressed by what he saw in Haifa, voted against partitioning Palestine and establishing a Jewish state in part of it. By the way, on November 29, Yugoslavia abstained. So how we can explain it? I would say very shortly, UNSCOP members were obliged to conform to the interests of their governments, and their considerations were only political rather than emotional. And in other words, with all due respect for sensitivity and emotion, in the final analysis, political decisions are made according to considerations which are much more down to earth and to the point. This was the case in the Exodus affair, and it is just as true in understanding the broader issue of Israel's moment from 1945 to 47 and even 48. Now, while my contention is that the Holocaust did not play a major role in the global arena in establishing Israel, and I would even claim that's following Professor Vital Frizel that was mentioned by Professor Stauber, I even dare to claim that contrary to the common assertion, actually the Holocaust almost frustrated the founding of a Jewish state. After having said that, I want to point to the impact that the Holocaust did have, and it did have within the Jewish people, an impact which in turn contributed to the establishment of Israel. The trauma suffered by the Jewish people between 1939 and 1945 changed conceptions and attitude and ignited new activities and methods of action, which due to time constraint, I will make do with two and present them in a very brief, I would say, telegraphic manner. One, the American Jewish community mobilized for the Zionist cause and became an active and assertive pressure group. Two, the Zionist leadership, driven by a deep conviction that it was now or never, was ready for compromises that were unthinkable before. I fully agree with Jeffrey Herf that, I'm quoting, despite objections to aspects of the partition plan, the Zionists in Palestine greeted the UN vote with jubilation. I would like to make one further step. The Zionists actually initiated the partition idea and worked very hard to have the UNSCOP recommendations adopted by the General Assembly. This line of action resulted from the resolution adopted by the Jewish Agency meeting in Paris in August 1946, when the goal of the Zionist policy was redefined as establishing a viable Jewish state in an adequate area of Palestine. My contention is that the demographic catastrophe that the Holocaust dealt on the Jewish people imposed a territorial, I'm trying to make it like a rime, the demographic catastrophe imposed a territorial geographical shrinkage of the Zionist solution. Thus, the Holocaust, more than being the cause of or push force toward the creation of the State of Israel had demographic consequences that made the division of Palestine a must on the outer front and an accepted notion by the majority of the Zionist movement. In this sense, the Holocaust did make the establishment of a Jewish state possible, but only in part of Palestine. To conclude, Professor Herf states that one of the key goals of the book, I'm quoting, is to bring the connection between the liberal and leftist spirit of the anti-fascism of World War II and its associated support for Zionism to the attention of several generations of readers whose political vocabulary dates primarily from the year since 1967. This is a well-deserved goal, which a thorough reading of the book leads to the conclusion that it was indeed achieved by either bringing back to the memory events and processes to those who have forgotten them, or by revealing what really happened to the generation which knew not Joseph. Thank you. רוני, אתה
Yes, okay, yes. Thank you very much, Aviva. I'm sure that we'll continue our debates and disagreements. But let us move now to Professor Roy. Professor Roy is a professor of history emeritus at Tel Aviv University. He has written and edited many books and many articles on Soviet history, including his latest publication, which I only mentioned his latest publication, The Soviet Union and the June 1967 Six-Day War, and the Jewish movement in the Soviet Union. And this is his most recent book, The Bleeding Wound, the Soviet War in Afghanistan and the Collapse of the Soviet Union in 2022. So Professor Roy, please.
Ronnie, thank you. For me, the book was an eye-opener. It was, of course, well known that the State Department and the Pentagon were not supporters of Zionist aspirations or of the establishment of the Jewish state in Palestine. But the conventional wisdom, at least my understanding, was that the principal reason was the need to have access to Arab oil, which meant not antagonizing the Arab countries or the Arab League. Jeffrey Herf documents very meticulously the identity of approach of the American foreign policy establishment and the British Foreign Office on another, possibly no less crucial reason, namely the apprehension that the immigrants to post-war Palestine in the years 45 to 48, who came mostly directly or indirectly from Eastern Europe, were sent there with the blessing of the Soviet government in order to turn the Jewish state into a communist satellite. Soviet and East European support for the Jewish Yishuv in Palestine and Zionist aspirations was evident from the very start of Israel's moment, in the preliminary stages of the implementation of Britain's decision to internationalize the Palestine problem and bring it before the United Nations. Among others, the Soviet and other East European representatives laid stress on the manifest link between the Jews' need for a country of their own in light of Jewish suffering during the recent World War. Jeffrey demonstrates how this contrasted with the position adopted by the American national security and foreign policy establishment, from whose multiple memorandum and reports the Holocaust was totally absent. From its point of view, the supported partition by the Soviet Union and the East European so-called people's democracies could have no other interpretation than a design to help turn the new Jewish state into a communist satellite. Undoubtedly, the Soviets wanted to weaken British influence in the Middle East and to end the British military presence in Palestine. A very early Soviet memo published in the Coming Center documents on Israeli-Soviet relations, dated March 1947, ends with the following sentence: Britain's referral of the Palestine question to the United Nations offers the Soviet Union its first opportunity, not only to express its point of view on the matter, but also to play an effective part in deciding the fate of Palestine. But this did not mean that the Mossad Bet's endeavors to enhance illegal immigration to Palestine were part of the Soviet effort to increase its influence in the region, or that Jews, Zionism, and communism were necessarily bedfellows. The American National Security Establishment then argued against the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine. The CIA pointed out that the pro-Zionist policy would make it all the more difficult to build the Arab states into bloc against the Soviet Union. Policy regarding Palestine had to be seen within the Anglo-American camp's effort to contain Soviet penetration of and involvement in the countries of the Near and Middle East that characterized the early period of the Cold War. George Kennan, who headed the State Department's policy planning staff, insisted that a pro-Zionist policy was inconsistent with the containment of communism the world over. Political, economic, and social stability were essential in the Middle East, especially in light of Soviet presence in its periphery and of Soviet infiltration into the area. Indeed, American ambassador in Moscow, Bedwell Smith, pointed out that Soviet policy was deliberately calculated to ensure unsettlement rather than settlement, and to create maximal difficulties for British and Americans in the Near East. He noted that the Near East was an area where the Soviet Union had nothing to lose, and given man's short memory and the flexibility of Soviet tactics, the Kremlin could recapture Arab goodwill by sudden reversal of position if and when its interests should so dictate. Gromyko, in November 1947, made several crucial points that Jeffrey rightly emphasizes. As he had done in May, he made several references to the Jewish people, a digression from the conventional Marxist-Leninist wisdom. Secondly, he dwelt on the Jewish people's close links to Palestine for a considerable period in history. Third, partition was in keeping with the principle of the national determination of peoples, applicable to both Jews and Arabs. And finally, partition was of profound historical significance, and I quote, because it will meet the legitimate demands of the Jewish people, hundreds of thousands of whom are still without a country, without homes, having found temporary shelter only in special camps in some Western countries. Shortly after the passing of the partition resolution, a lengthy policy planning staff memo penned by Kennan detailed various aspects of the resolution that would be deleterious to US interests. Among others, the establishment of Jewish state in Palestine was a boon for Soviet prospects in the Middle East. If the plan necessitated implementation by force, which now seemed to be the case given its total rejection by the Arabs, the Russians would offer to participate in maintaining order by sending in Russian troops. The presence of a Soviet force in Palestine would be an incentive for local communist parties to extend their activities and try to overthrow existing regimes and replace them by democratic people's governments. It would constitute an outflanking of US positions in Greece, Turkey, and Iran, and be a threat to stability in the entire Eastern Mediterranean. Favorable to Soviet objectives of sowing dissension and discord in non-communist countries, it might even encourage partition in these three countries. One senior voice in the administration, however, also viewing the partition plan from the point of view of the Cold War, put the exactly opposite position. Truman Special Assistant Clark Clifford insisted the partition was the only course of action with respect to Palestine that will strengthen our position vis-à-vis Russia. Moreover, retreat from partition would undermine the UN, an organization that could consolidate anti-Soviet forces throughout the world. The US could not give the Russians the opportunity to step in as defenders of world peace and champions of the UN. Moreover, the Arab social and economic order would be irreparably harmed by adopting a Soviet orientation, and it would be suicide for the ruling classes within the Soviet orbital influence. Finally, in opposition to what Truman was hearing from the CIA and from Britain, Jewish Palestine was strongly oriented to the US and away from Russia, and will remain so unless the collapse of the UN brings Russian and unilateral military intervention to Palestine. When the Security Council reconvened in April 1948 to discuss the situation in Palestine, Gromyko identified completely his Chertok-Shavet's statement that the truce revolution put forward by the US and UK favored the Arabs by imposing restrictions solely on the Jewish side in the evolving conflict in Palestine. The head of the Soviet UN delegation pointed out that the draft cast aspersions on the perfectly legal and lawful Jewish immigration to Palestine and ignored the necessity for the withdrawal of armed groups which have entered Palestine from outside in order to take part in the struggle. All the armed bands which have invaded Palestine must be called upon to withdraw, and the future invasion of such groups prevented. Meanwhile, the apprehension of the US national security establishment were nurtured by shipments of Czechoslovak military equipment to the Assyrian Palestine, and by the departure from Palestine from Czechoslovakia of young male Jews of military age who had records of military service in the Soviet army or the Soviet-sponsored Polish army. Truman's de facto recognition of the new Jewish state was supported not only by Clark Clifford, but as already been pointed out, by a number of senators and congressmen and the wide American public, including now the New York Times, and by numerous calls for the US to lift its embargo on arms to the Middle East, which meant basically Israel. Roosevelt's former Undersecretary of State, Sumner Welles, argued that the US, in refusing to allow the Security Council to use force if necessary to enforce partition, was repeating the League of Nations' failure to stop aggression in the 1930s. It was failing morally by not supporting the just cause of persecuted Jewry in its need for a state of Palestine, and committed a major strategic blunder in vain attempts to appease the Arabs, because the Jewish state would be the West's most reliable ally against Soviet expansion in the Middle East. Kennan stood his ground. From his point of view, Truman's recognition of Israel threatens not only to place in jeopardy some of our most vital interests in the Middle East and the Mediterranean, but also to stop unity of the Western world and to undermine our entire policy toward the Soviet Union. This, incidentally, was a major objective of Soviet policy, to split the Anglo-American alliance. Throughout Israel's war of independence, in every UN debate, in every UN forum, the representatives of the Soviet Union and Soviet bloc took positions in favor of the Jews and Israel. They were Israel's best friends, creating a situation of simultaneity of Soviet bloc support for Israel in the very months in which the Cold War was reaching a deep freeze in Europe. Soviet support continued until Israel's admission to the UN in May 1949, when again the Soviet bloc in its entirety voted in favor. Poland's UN ambassador, speaking about Israel's application to UN membership, spoke of Jewish sufferings at the hands of Polish reaction before World War II. But now, and I quote, a period of sentimental interest in the fate of Israel had come to an end, to be replaced by one of cooperation and mutual interest. The Jewish people, advancing along peaceful and progressive lines, could rely on the assistance of Poland, the Soviet republics, and the people's democracies in Europe. Jeffrey does not point out that in communist Soviet-inspired terminology, this seemingly entirely supportive statement entailed a clear warning. If Israel digressed from peaceful and progressive lines, it could not count on, even expect, the continued support of the Soviet bloc. By now, concomitantly with the anti-cosmopolitan campaign that was infused with anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and accusations, the Soviet Union was turning vehemently against Israel. In so doing, it did all it could to suppress the public memory of the support it had given in order to realize Zionist aspirations in Palestine. Throughout the bloc, communists accused of Zionism were purged. The assertion that Zionism was a product of American imperialism was central to the 4-decade-long campaign of communist anti-Zionism. But the CIA analysis of 1953 described the situation accurately when it noted that the communist position had been directly opposed to that of the Arab states. It supported the partition resolution both from the start and post-factum. Indeed, it was responsible for its passage. It was responsible for the defeat of Arab proposals on the Palestine question and the US proposed trusteeship, and for present conditions in Palestine and consequent instability throughout the Arab East. George Kennan played a key role in making opposition to the establishment of the Jewish state in Palestine into a component of the global strategy of containing communism. The national security and foreign policy establishment misunderstood Zionism's political orientation and its democratic essence, as Jeffrey very rightly points out, perhaps because of its strong roots in Eastern Europe, leading it to fail to take advantage of short-lived Soviet support for establishing the Jewish state and to champion what would become the most effective source of opposition to Soviet expansion in the Middle East. It misconstrued Zionist willingness to seek assistance where it could as support for communism and Soviet goals. The presence of communists among Jewish refugees was, according to Jeffrey, an understandable consequence of the Nazi war on Jewish Bolshevism, blinded them to the fact that these communists comprised a very small minority that could not harm British or American interests in the Middle East. Stalin, again to quote Jeffrey, placed an expensive bet on the Zionists in the hope that they would drive Britain and the US out of the Middle East. Other communists did so because they believed that doing so was a continuation of the anti-fascism of World War II, and as communists, they regarded the Jewish state as a logical consequence of the Holocaust and the Allied victory over Nazi. Apart from Gromyko's 14 May 47 speech, those of the Polish and Ukrainian delegates were equally emphatic in their memories of the Holocaust and embrace of the Zionist project. American diplomats were correct in seeing the Soviet position as part of the Soviet Union's overall strategy in the Cold War, but no one could deny the conviction in the Polish ambassador's speech that has already been mentioned, when he told the UN General Assembly that as an Auschwitz survivor, he was supporting the Jews' drive for statehood. And it was only the Soviet bloc that could and did supply the arms and the immigrants that Israel needed in order to survive. While the main focus of the research read Israel's movement, its US policy had to extend also French policy. Jeffrey provides a telling survey of Soviet policies presented in the International Forum in the 2 years, May 47 to May 49. In so doing, he demonstrates how the exigencies of great power policymaking may bring major players in global politics to digress from their traditional positions in order to take advantage of regional turning points, to gain points in the ultimate and from a Soviet or Russian viewpoint, as we see today in Ukraine, the inevitable tug of war that is the essence of power politics. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, I would suggest, Jeffrey, that the first you relate to, I suppose that you'd like to relate to some of the main points that were raised by Aviva, Yaakov, and maybe myself. And then we'll open the floor for the audience.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you very much to the three of you for such careful engagement with the book. And I'm, you know, what more can an author ask for? So I'm very grateful. I'm going to be very brief in my replies because there are people here who have been very patient on Zoom, and I would imagine want to have questions of their comments of their own. First, the issue that that you raised, Ronnie, about the impact of the Holocaust and the thesis that Israel was a product of power politics. As Yaakov Roy's summary of parts of the book indicates, and my own summary, the argument in Washington and London for power politics was anti-Zionist. It was as simple as that. I mean, the evidence is really massive that in the containment of the Soviet, the main issue was Europe and containing the Soviet Union in Europe. And while Israel was an emotional phenomenon in world politics. It was a sideshow from the perspective of policymakers in Washington and in London. The main event was containing the Soviet Union in Europe, and Europe needed oil in order to recover economically after the war in the Marshall Plan. So the real political arguments in Washington and London were all opposed to the establishment of the Jewish state. Clark Clifford, as Yaakov mentioned, convinced Harry Truman that the state of Israel could be an asset rather than a liability. But the ideas that Marshall and Kennan and Lovett and others articulated in 1947-48 remained a consensus within the State Department. And if I was going to write a second book, and this one would have to be in collaboration with people who read the Israeli Hebrew language archives, it would be called The Era of Distance. The Era of Distance. American relations with Israel, 1948 to 1967 or 69. Within the national security establishment, the state of Israel was regarded as a problem for a long time, and it wasn't really until after the victory of the 6-Day War that American policymakers concluded that Israel would be more of an asset than a liability. It's interesting to see Aviva Halamish's and Ronnie Stauber's discussion of the relationship between the Holocaust and the establishment of the state of Israel. I wasn't fully aware that this has been such a topic of debate and discussion. Clearly, the murder of 6 million Jews was not going to help anything in terms of the establishment of the state of Israel. I mean, the loss of such a fantastic loss of life would certainly make the establishment of a new state more difficult. But Harry Truman was like Winston Churchill and like Franklin Roosevelt. These three leaders were all in the traditions of Anglo-American Protestantism, and I think that the role of these philo-Semitic Protestants needs more attention. That none of them wore their religion on their sleeve. They didn't give speeches about God and this and that and the other thing a great deal, but they did see the Holocaust as due to certain continuities of Western religious and cultural traditions in Christianity, and that yes, there was a responsibility to change, and at long last to end the absence of Jewish sovereignty. So those kind of arguments, Ronald and Alice Radosh in their book about Harry Truman discusses Truman's own the relationship between his religious convictions and his political decision making. But clearly, he had to get the arguments from Clark Clifford that the state of Israel would be an asset and not a liability. When one thinks about the discussions in the United States of Robert Wagner, Emanuel Seller, the American Zionist Emergency Council, the liberals in New York, anti-Nazism and the Holocaust loomed very large in their thinking. And when one thinks about Depreux and Mach or Jean-Paul Sartre and others in Paris, then the political, pragmatic response to the Holocaust in Paris and in Washington and New York was not at that time to build memorials to Auschwitz, memorials to the Jews, and to focus on Holocaust memory. The thing to do at that point was to make it possible for the Jews to defend themselves so that this would not happen again. So the case for Jewish sovereignty was the political response for liberals in the United States and socialists and Gaullists and communists and radicals in France. And in that sense, the Holocaust certainly had an impact on support for the Zionist project where it existed. And as Yaakov Roy mentioned, that this was the case also in the speeches of the United Nations from Gromyko and Federkivich and Tarasenko. So I think I would not agree that the Holocaust did not play a major role for those who supported it. For those who opposed it, and here Yaakov Roy reads my book very well, it is striking to read Kennan and Lovett and Henderson and or James Forrestal. The Holocaust didn't really sink into them at all. World War II was about defeating Nazi Germany, and the Holocaust was something that happened, but it was really not very much on their radar. And while this raises the question of anti-Semitism, which I don't go into in great detail, but the association of Jews and communism, obviously by the Nazis, was not something that happened in London and Washington, but nevertheless, there was a suspicious connection between Zionism and communism, so one is struck in reading the files by the lack of empathy and emotion about the recent Holocaust and how quickly people were focused immediately on policy at the moment. I'm very, very pleased that Yaakov Roy found the book to be an eye-opener. That is itself amazing, given his distinguished scholarship for decades. And I hope that eye-opener is something that readers in Israel will find of interest. I would just conclude by saying this, because I do want to hear your responses and from the panel and others. It's this: what has happened in public perception and often in scholarship is a projection of the American alliance with Israel that emerged really in 1969 or 70, a projection of that alliance backward into the late 1940s. And so the book is not only a book about the limits of American support for the Zionist project in the national security establishment, it also implicitly urges people in France and in Israel to devote much more attention to the importance of France's alliance with Israel between 1948 and 1967. And I would go so far as to say that in those years, Israel had one really reliable ally in this world, and that was not the United States, it was France. Again, thank you very much for these very detailed comments and for the engagement with the book. I'm very grateful, and you've given me a lot to think about.
Okay, so let's open now the floor for your comments. I see that there are, Sarah, I see that there are a few chats.
Yeah.
But I think that they are very long, so each of them. So I'm not sure that we should read all of them now. So let us hear if someone want to ask or to make a comment.
Well, we did say,
Yes,
just a second, there is the question from Shmuel Yerushalmi that did have to leave, but we told him that we'd make sure that the question got asked aloud.
Okay.
Where is it? Is it we are, okay. Is there any similarity, any connection between BDS and different anti-Israeli movements of today to opposition to the establishment of the Jewish country in Palestine between 1945 to 1949?
What has changed is that the meaning of left and right has changed. So between 1945 and 1949, the quote imperialist, if you want to use the term, establishment was opposed to the Zionist project. It was an opposition from quote the right. uh, and the not because it didn't have anything to do with claims about anti-racism or something like that. And BDS involves a redefinition of the meaning of what it means to be leftist. So to be a leftist or a liberal in New York and Washington, or a socialist or communist or a liberal in Paris, meant to be a Zionist. That was a defining feature of liberalism and leftism in those years. BDS is a reflection of the redefinition of left and right since the Zionism is racism resolution of the 1970s. And that redefinition is something that the book wants to draw attention
to. Okay.
I see there's a question in the chat about Eleanor Roosevelt.
Yes.
Yeah. Eleanor Roosevelt was indeed a strong supporter of establishing the Jewish state. She served on the United Nations, the American delegation to the United Nations, and she was so angry about the State Department's efforts to undermine the partition plan and to replace it with what was called a trusteeship proposal that she threatened to resign and from the delegation, which would have, given that she was Eleanor Roosevelt and who she was, George Marshall immediately recognized this would be a serious problem, and so he got back to her within a day or two, and urged her to stay on. But yeah, she was an iconic. She is, of course, an iconic figure of American liberalism in those years, and illustrates the point I just made about the meaning of what it meant to be a liberal, and to be an anti-racist, and to be an anti-racist. Zionism was seen as a form of anti-racism, and when there were demonstrations or rallies in New York City, it was the Arab Higher Committee and Haj Amin al-Husseini, or then Jamal Husseini, who were seen as articulating racist principles. So the book is also calls for a reassessment of the founding years of the nationalism of the Palestine Arabs. And then Yosef Ben-Dor asks, how come U.S. political intelligence made such a colossal mistake as assuming that Israel would have pro-Soviet foreign policy focus? Well, the United States never makes mistakes. Didn't you know that, Mr. Ben-Dor? All right, we're right about everything all the time. It's a great country. The impact of British intelligence on American intelligence was profound. The Americans came to the Middle East as amateurs, and it was the Brits who were professionals. So what the British said about Zionism and Palestine and all that carried huge weight in the State Department and in the Pentagon. And the British were the driving force in the intelligence matters of this notion that the Soviet Union was sending NKVD agents in the refugee stream to Palestine. And that and of course, then they would seize one of these boats, and then there would be a lot of refugees who had leftist literature on them. And then you see, there's people that there are a bunch of Marxists they're importing into Palestine. And of course, there was some truth to that, but fundamentally, they didn't understand the American intelligence in the CIA was, this was part of the change from World War II to the Cold War, and the change from the Office of Strategic Services and the liberals in the OSS to fighting the Cold War and the CIA. So the old connection between Jews and communism survived in the association of of Jews and Zionists with the Soviet bloc. And the more that Andrew Gromyko and Vasyl Tarasenko and Alfred Federkivich and others in New York would make the case in favor of the Zionists, the more people in Washington would say, you see, they're the Soviets. They're making the same argument with the Zionists, and Sherrod and Avi Iban. They're making the same arguments with Gromyko and Tarasenko. Look, it's very clear, right? It was a huge, colossal intelligence blunder, and I think, yes, I think some of it was the product of some conventional wisdom about the Jews that was not so pleasant.
Still, Jeffrey?
Yeah.
Still, I would say that it's amazing, as I tried to say before. I worked also in American archives, particularly in files of American Foreign Minister Foster Dulles. And I know that whenever they have a meeting with someone from abroad, they are preparing such a huge profile about this person for the foreign minister. So I'm amazed because they knew Ben-Gurion. He wasn't someone that people didn't know him. And they knew Moshe Sharet, and they knew how their perspective, how they feel so close to the West. And so I'm really still amazed by the fact that they thought that Israel will be an ally of the Soviet Union. Still a question.
Well, the strategy of the United States in the early days of the Cold War, and this included the CIA, was to enlist parties of the center left, the socialists in France, the Social Democrats in West Germany, the Italian Socialists, the British Labour Party, because the American foreign policy makers understood that if the Cold War against the Soviet Union was going to be dominated by Catholic conservative parties in Western Europe only, or primarily, that the United States would politically lose the Cold War in Italy and France and West Germany, and the Soviet Union would politically win the war in Europe. They understood that. And they worked closely with the parties of the center left. They did not want the Cold War to be a religious crusade against atheistic communists. I mean, they spoke that way, of course. But so the question, Ronnie, that your comment raises is, why didn't they recognize that Ben-Gurion and Sherrod were like Kurt Schumacher or Ernst Bevin? Or the French, or Pierre Mendès France, or Paul Ramadier. Why didn't they recognize that these people had pretty much the same political ideas that the people they wanted to work with in Europe?
Sure.
And that gets back to the United States in the late 1940s, when a certain gentleman's anti-Semitism was part of American life and American political establishment. So I think that has to be taken into account in thinking about some of the intelligence failures of those years. And that's the way that I.F. Stone and Frieda Kirchway and Emanuel Seller saw things. And they were not shy about saying that in things that they were writing and saying in 1946, 7, 8.
Okay. Simcha, you had a question?
Yes, can you hear me? Yes, well, thank you I have a remark. Thank you for those impressive lectures. And indeed, this was an eye-opener. Even though I haven't yet read the book, I would like to relate to what Professor Aviva Halamish said when she suggested that she was not actually convinced, if I understood well, of Truman's moral imperative. So I'd like to offer several examples as someone who had the privilege to sit a whole month at the Truman Library in Missouri, Independence, Missouri. And I've read there some of his files, and of course the Palestine file. And I must say that it started quite early, that Truman was convinced that the displaced person problem, not only Jews, but eventually he actually focused on Jews, but the Jewish displaced person problems eventually was what he called a world tragedy. And this was actually said as a message to the Congress in July 7th, 1947. And in fact, a lot of letters written to him by his friend Eddie Jacobsen were absolutely significant, and I think extremely influential for him, because for the anecdote, Eddie Jacobsen had participated in World War I. He had actually founded a haberdashery shop with him. They started with, well, actually they went bankrupt, but they had started both of them with a barber shop and then a tailor shop, and then went bankrupt. So it actually was a strong tie. And whereas Truman was very much, as you said, Professor Jeff Herf, they were WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. And this was particularly true for, you said Winston Churchill, yes, and Truman, because Truman was an avid reader of the Bible. And this has had an immense impact on his view of the Jews. And yes, the Shoah, the Holocaust, had an impact because the Jewish displaced person problems and the Exodus and everything you said was extremely important, even though there was a tremendous opposition from the State Department and the Pentagon through Henderson and through all the others that you mentioned, and essentially Marshall, who thought that a Jewish state wouldn't be able to live without 5,000 American troops, at least, if I remember well. But what is actually interesting is that whereas he was quite fed up with the Zionist pressure, because he received lots and lots of letters from the Zionists, to the point that recently, I mean, in 2004, I think, a page of his diary was revealed, and what could be interpreted as anti-Semitism was in fact the fact that he was fed up with Zionists, but he always remained emotionally connected to the plight of Jewish displaced persons. Now, his memoirs show, and this was confirmed by his biographer, David McCullough, his memoirs show that he never thought that it could actually be a state, but he wanted Palestine as a refuge. But it seems that it's only because of the advent of the Cold War that he was rushed into, maybe it sounds a bit too simplistic, but he was rushed into realizing that the refuge was not possible, but that through the as you put forward the case, the impact of the Soviet Union, this state could play a role in the Cold War. Sorry if I've been a bit long, but in the end, it started as a humanitarian argument, and that's how we can relate it to the Holocaust. And eventually, it turned out to be an ideological response. And this also worked out with the displaced persons problem at large, not only the Jews, because in 1948, there was a senator in the Congress, his name was Wiley, W-I-L-E-Y, who realized that no, DPs are not Jews and are not communists, but on the contrary, they are symbols of the failure of communism, and therefore this was an argument to let them in through the displaced person law in the United States in June 1948. So in fact, there are those three elements: their admission to the United States, but through 4 years of debates about Jewish displaced persons and displaced persons in general. But as you said, there was that equation between DPs and communists, and the fact that the Cold War was there. Sorry if I've been a bit long.
That is a mini lecture in itself. And there's a lot in it with which I agree. Ronald and Alice Ranosh have written a book called A Safe Haven, which is about Truman and his decisions and motivations that overlap with much of what you've just said. But there's another aspect to Israel's moment that perhaps I should emphasize a bit more, and that is that Truman supported the partition resolution of the United Nations and recognized the new state. But in terms of practical support, that was it. The United States didn't, break the British blockade. The United States didn't send ships to bring displaced persons, refugees to Palestine. It was the Soviet bloc in France that did that, and maybe Italian socialists, maybe Italy also plays a role here as well. So I come back to Ben Gurion, that the state of Israel was established because of what the Jews in Palestine did, and not because of what Harry Truman did. That may seem very obvious, and maybe even too obvious to state, but I think a little more attention on David Ben Gurion and Moshe Sherrod than Harry Truman might be a good idea. The two of them together were quite a team, and it was their decisions and the decisions and risks and lives and sacrifices of so many other people that brought about the establishment of the state of Israel. People had to be willing to fight and die, and without that, there would be no state. So, there was a horrible conversation between Moshe Sherrod and George Marshall in the spring of '48, when Sherrod is telling him that the Zionists are going to establish a state, and Marshall says, "Well, as a military man, let me tell you that sometimes military plans go awry, and things don't work out as you wish. So if things don't work out as you wish," he said to Sherrod, "don't come running to the United States for help. Don't come running to the United States for help." Yeah. Aviva?
Yeah. I would like to make a short comment in reference to the third presentation we just heard by Professor Uzan. First of all, I think we are in agreement that the problem was the DPs, and the United States wanted to solve the problem not only on moral basis, but also because they were concentrated about 150,000 who were in the American occupied occupation zone, and it cost them $2 a day for each person. I'm just making it very simplified, but I agree with you that the problem of the DPs was very crucial in this regard. And you mentioned the change in the immigration law. In June 1948, they allowed 400,000 DPs to enter the United States. And historians don't like to ask what could happen if, but many people said what could happen if this decision was made before the state of Israel was established. But I leave this for now. I want to mention one thing that is mentioned in the book. In between the decision by the United Nations in November 1947 and the establishment of the State of Israel in the spring, April 1948, it seemed to the United States that the Jewish community in Palestine won't be able to stand the attacks by the Arabs in Palestine, and even more so, what they expected the attack by the armies of other states and the Arab states. And in the spring of 1948, just a few months before the State of Israel was established, actually the United States withdrew its support for the Resolution 181 and wanted to establish a trusteeship in Palestine for a while. So I'm saying if the Holocaust was such an important, had such an important role and such heavy weight on the decision, how comes it was changed in such a short time? And we don't have time to go into all the details. I had to cut short my presentation with other arguments, but I still believe that the Holocaust was a moral issue. It was many people were expressed their feelings about the Holocaust, but I say that I still believe that when it came to realpolitik, to decisions, the decisions were more down to earth. The situation in the Middle East, the Cold War, the situation in Europe, etc., etc. So this is a matter that
I agree with you. I agree with you, and the issue of the Holocaust is one that concerns why liberals supported the establishment of the Jewish state, and for that it is central. But you and Ronnie, when making arguments about power politics, I agree with you that in the halls of power in London and Washington and in Moscow, it was not the Holocaust that was primary on their minds. They made the shift from World War II to the Cold War with remarkable speed, and the Zionist project was not one that fit well into their consideration. So yeah.
I'm glad we are in agreement.
Walney, you're muted.
No, I hear him.
I see that there is a question. Yes, please. Yes, Ken.
You'd like me to read it? Or you want Walney?
הגברת רוצה לשאול משהו.
So we need to unmute her.
אז אני עושה את זה?
אני עשיתי.
אוקיי, הנה.
כן.
Okay, yes, please.
Maybe the reaction upon Jewish repatriation to the Yishuv in Palestine should also be viewed in the bounded thoughts of emancipation, of that is also the the emancipation of Russian peasantry and the ingredients appropriated and absorbed within the Jewish minority of this repatriation. That is, and also that could explain the reactions why there was a liberalist support for a Jewish repatriation to Eretz Israel. That is the rejection of authoritarian yoke, the rejection of previous coercion structures on one hand, and the Jewish appropriation of this type of emancipation actually the Jewish agency and kibbutz movement could be viewed as Deutscher viewed it as a narodnik movement, and it could be viewed as narodnik movement wrapped in Marxism. And it could also, the paradox, it seems that there was some kind of a synthesis amongst the Trotskyist idea to take to arms and in self-defense, of course, and the physiocratic idea to return to land. And maybe this combination also could explain the reasons for which liberalist movements supported, at least temporarily, the Zionist project. Stalinism rested partially upon populist ideas. It is not only a matter now, but why didn't the Soviet Union continue to support Eretz Israel vis-a-vis the Arab adversary? I think that there is too much of an emancipation ingredient in Zionism for Stalinism to support it permanently. They actually build upon a hierarchy of coercion, and the blend of collectivism, individualism embedded in the Zionist repatriation is not congruent with any Stalinist conception. Then there is additional dimension, and this is that the Jews actually repatriating to Eretz Israel paradoxically relinquished every prior nationality affiliation and created something, created an emergent level which is not reducible to a notion of collectivism, socialism in one country. And I think because of this, let me say the affinity among Stalinist Russia and Eretz Israel would be short-lived, relatively short-lived. I don't want to take too much time because I need to read Professor Herf's book. I haven't. So, but I just wanted to explain that it may sound a little bit odd that the cosmopolitan idea of Trotsky is embedded here, but it is simply to take to arms in order to protect the movement, which is a libertarian, which is a emancipating, which is a revolutionary movement of physiocratic return to the land. Now, of course, Dreyfus' story and the Holocaust constitute, that is the Holocaust, especially a powerful catalysator, a powerful general collapse of everything known, priorly known. But this movement had a force long before that. And that is not only the emancipation of Russian, that is the majority of the Russian population, 80%, that the Jewish minority may have been inspired by and may have been released by, and also claimed its rights already in the Revolution 1905. That is the freedom.
You need to, okay. Yes, thank you. Jeffrey, you want to relate to it? Or?
Well, actually, I'd like to know what Yaakov Roy has to say about the Soviet turn in the purges, and my reading was that when Stalin understood after the 1949 elections that the Israeli Communist Party had received 3% of the vote and Mapam had received 14%, and Ben-Gurion was able to establish a coalition government without the communists or Mapam, that Stalin understood that his bet on Israel had not panned out, and that was important for the Soviet switch. But Yaakov, you've written about this a great deal, and I'd like to know what you think about the Soviet turn.
Okay. That brings me also to the question that Ronnie asked before. Never, at no point, did the Soviet Union think that Israel will become part of the communist bloc. The intention of the Soviet Union in supporting the establishment of the State of Israel was purely tactical. As realpolitik, they wanted Israel to exist. They wanted a Jewish state to exist in the Arab world. Because as Bertel Smith said, they wanted unsettlement and not settlement. And they knew that Arabs would not accept the Jewish state. And they knew that the conflict would be a conflict that would be protracted for a very long time and perhaps forever. As to Jeff's question, let's put it this way. I think well before the elections in January 1949, and I wrote that about in my Soviet Decision-Making in Practice, which is the book that, in fact, is based on my PhD thesis, that the Soviet Union was already turning against Israel in the late summer of 1948, when the Czechoslovak ceased sending arms to Israel, and when the Jews reacted the way they did react to the arrival of Golda Meir in Moscow. It was quite clear to him then that there was no way for him to continue supporting Israel, but he made a schizophrenic decision to continue supporting Israel in the international arena until Israel became a member of the family of nations and was received into the United Nations. But by then he was already turning against Israel very, very clearly and very definitely. Already in December 1948, a major pamphlet came out that denigrated the Israeli left as Zionist, including Mapam, as Zionist, and showed that there was no way that the Soviet Union could consider finding any long-term support in Israel among Zionist circles.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay. So I thank you very much. I think that we'll end now. It was a fascinating evening, fascinating book. And I hope that many people in Israel and around the world will read the book, from which you can learn a lot. Thank you very much, Jeffrey. We are looking forward for your coming to Israel, to Tel Aviv University next year. And there will be many more opportunities to hear you. So thank you, Aviva. Thank you, Yaakov. Thank you, the organizers, Sarah and Adi. And good evening to all of you.
Well, thank you.
And good morning to you, Jeffrey.
Yeah, well,
Thank
thank you. Yes, thank
Ronnie,
you.
and thank you, Jeffrey, again for the book, which is a very important contribution to the scholarship of this period.
Well, I'm very gratified to hear that. And, you know, it's been a pleasure having the chance to speak with all of you, both Yaakov and Viva and Ronnie, and also the people who asked such good questions. Clearly, the book stimulated a lot of, or touched, struck some nerves there, and so that I'm very pleased about that. So,
Okay, so
Okay.
thank you very much, and bye-bye.
bye-bye. Take care.